Cool. Thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. I'm actually really honored to be able to talk with you guys. So what Sam didn't mention is I'm actually an alumnus of product school. About 4 years ago, I was in one of the 2014, 2015 cohorts and took the 6-week product management class, and really was beneficial. So highly recommend that. So today we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about a product and innovation framework called Jobs to be Done. Who here is familiar, has heard of this before? JTBD, 1, 2, a couple more, awesome. So it's a relatively new framework, and we're going to talk a little bit about what it is, why it's useful, how you can use it. Cool. All right, so let's sort of dive in. So first, I'll give a quick background of myself. So as Sam mentioned, I have a background in engineering. As I was transitioning in a product, I always thought it was interesting and fascinating to understand how folks transitioned depending on where they came from. So this is a really quick timeline of sort of my career and sort of transition in a product. Back in 2005, that's when I graduated university at Georgia Tech in computer science. My first job out of school was doing Perl programming for a really cool indie magazine called Paste. It no longer exists, but it was probably the coolest job I've had. And then I worked for IQ and Sapient, which are some agencies and consulting firms. And I did that for a while, and I really wanted to get into product engineering, developing products rather than working on client projects. And so that's what brought me to Eventbrite out here to San Francisco. And then that sort of kicks off my sort of period of orange, so between Eventbrite, Strava, and Zwift. That is sort of the period where I really began the transition into product management, tried to get my foot in the water. Eventbrite was my first job actually working with a product manager, and my very first product manager is the one who planted the seed in my head about becoming a product manager. I remember my first or second week on the job, he pulled me out of my cube at the end of the day and took me to an event and watched me, or allowed me to watch event organizers checking in events at the door to see how painful of a process that was. And to me, that was really eye-opening. It was the first time for me to understand that sort of building products is more than writing beautiful, well-architected, well-tested code. It's more than a great design with sort of great animations. It's really about the user experience. And the user experience is really about understanding what a customer's struggle is and doing whatever it takes to solve that struggle. And so, like I said, I attended product school in 2015. My first role as a product manager, where I didn't have to have any engineering responsibilities, was at Athos. That's the White Diamond. And then on to GoPro, where I was a product manager, and currently at Square. At Square, I'm on our developer platform team. That's the team that enables third-party developers to build commerce solutions, custom commerce solutions, on Square's public APIs. Cool. So what is Jobs to be Done? So this is really jargony and buzzwordy at the front, but we're going to dive into some practical examples very, very shortly. But on this, basically, Jobs to be Done is a framework that's really centered around the idea that customers, consumers, they have this idea of attaining progress towards some goal. They have an idea in mind of, I want to get something done. I want to see progress being made toward that thing. And customers hire and fire product and services that help them achieve that, achieve those goals and attain that progress. And by asking those customers the right questions, you can sort of uncover marketing and product innovations that will allow you to sell to more customers and bring more customers into your product. And really the who behind Jobs to be Done, there's two guys on the screen. On the left is Clay Christensen. Who here has heard of Clay? A couple folks. Okay, so Clay's most famous for his relatively, most famous, I think, in the Bay Area and in technology for his book Innovator's Dilemma, which spawned from a lot of research and a lot of theories that came out of his sort of professorial sort of research at Harvard, where he's a professor. So he developed this theory called innovative disruption, and that sparked the book Innovator's Dilemma. And from that extracted this new framework, which we're talking about now. On the right is a colleague of Clay, Bob Moesta, who took the framework and built a company around it, a consulting firm that companies hire to understand why customers are using their product. Basically, if you do any jobs to be done, research online, if you learn more, you'll always see these two folks show up. You'll see a couple other folks, other names like Alan Clement, Anthony Ulwick, but these are basically the godfathers. Clay is very much the academic, the theoretical. Bob is like, okay, how do we actually apply a framework in an existing sort of organization? So that's sort of the boring stuff. How does this relate to milkshakes? At the start, I had a screenshot of a milkshake. So I'll start with a question. Can anyone guess how big the milkshake market is? For those who are not familiar with jobs to be done, can anyone guess how big the milkshake market is, or even how you might even start to approach that problem? Any takers? So we'll come back to this. It's a tough question, right? It's loaded. But we'll come back to this because there's actually a really interesting answer to this. So let's start with a use case. So this is a picture of a Burger King in Switzerland. To sort of paint the picture, it's not actually the restaurant that I'm about to talk about. So there was a fast food company, McDonald's, that a while ago saw stagnating milkshake sales. Milkshakes are highly profitable, very high profit margin, and by increasing sales of milkshakes, they increase the franchises and the franchisors' bottom line, and they were seeing milkshake sales stagnant in comparison to their competitors. So they were trying to figure out, how do we increase sales of milkshake? Thinking about that problem, how do I increase sales of milkshakes? How would you approach that as a product manager? What are some of the things you might look at? Yeah, exactly. So talk to users that drank milkshakes. And this is exactly what they did, because it's McDonald's. They had reams and reams and reams of customer data, demographic data, that talked about which customers bought which milkshakes. And so they ran these extensive focus groups and said, what do you like about our milkshake? Would you buy this milkshake if it came in more flavors? Would you buy it if it was chocolatier or mintier or had more banana or peanut butter in it? And guess what the focus group said? They said, yes, we would love that, definitely. So they rolled out the changes, and some customers, like this adorable dog, loved the new milkshakes. Unfortunately, the sales continue to flatline. So by implementing those changes, they didn't really see any uplift in those milkshake sales. So what does the restaurant do next? Well, they decided to bring in an external consultant. So they bring in Clay and Clay's team. And Clay's really happy because he gets to drink a lot of milkshakes. So Clay comes in to assess the situation, and he first wants to understand, when are milkshakes sold throughout the day? So him and his team go to this restaurant, go to this McDonald's. They spend a whole week, 18 hours a day, just observing customers to see when milkshakes are sold. And guess when the most milkshakes are sold at this restaurant? Yeah. So over 50% of the milkshakes were sold before 8 a.m., which is kind of weird, right? Like it makes sense you might see some of them sold, but over 50% are being sold before 8 in the morning. I mean, that's really early. So who is buying that? Who is buying those milkshakes? It turns out most of the milkshakes were sold at the drive-thru, which kind of further complicates the equation. Why at the drive-thru? Why before 8 in the morning? Why 50%? So Clay's team spent about, like I said, a week, 18 hours a day, asking customers why they bought the milkshake. So, why did you buy this milkshake, ma'am? And she would say, because it's good, because I like it, because this is my favorite flavor. But that's the same information that the focus groups gave, right? That's not really actionable. It's not really insightful. It doesn't really get to the why behind it. So Clay and his team asked a very different question to these customers. He said, what job did you hire that milkshake to do? And you know what they said? They said, I don't know what you're talking about. What the heck does that even mean? So they asked a slightly different question. Asked the same question in a slightly different way. What other products have you hired for this job besides a milkshake? Think about the last time it was the same kind of situation, but instead of coming here to this McDonald's, driving through and buying a milkshake, you did something else. And that revealed quite a few insights. What they found out is most of these customers who were buying these milkshakes had a very long, boring commute to work. And they were looking for something to keep them occupied, engaged, interested in life, alive, awake during this time while they were stuck in traffic. So that's the job that they hired this milkshake to do. And in thinking about what else have they hired other than a milkshake, they gave a few other job candidates that they've tried. One customer said, I sometimes hire a banana, but it takes about a minute to eat, and then I'm starving by 8 in the morning, so doesn't do a great job. Another customer said, sometimes I'll hire a bagel, but they're so dry, they're so crumbly, and you got to put jam and cream cheese in it, and I'm in the traffic steering with both wheels, and then the phone rings, and it's a mess, and it creates a mess in my car. So it's not that great. Another customer said, as you can see, I've probably hired the donut one too many times. The problem with the donut is it's hard to have just one, and so that brings additional problems into the fold, along with it being kind of messy. One customer said, don't tell my significant other, but I once hired a Snickers. But I felt so guilty about eating Snickers at 6 in the morning that I'll never do it again. So, banana, bagel, donut, candy bar. We've learned why they didn't work out for those customers. And from that, we can tease out what's known in Jobs to be Done as hiring criteria. And this is what they are. The hiring criteria for this job is it needs to be quick and easy to get. It needs to be consumable for at least the duration of the commute. Ideally, it'll keep me full until lunchtime. It won't make me feel guilty, and it's messy. It isn't messy, and it's easy to consume. So, of all the options, what kind of fills that hiring criteria for these customers? Turns out it's the restaurant's milkshake. One of the customers said, sipping that thick milkshake through its thin straw is the best part of my morning. It takes 23 minutes, and it's the best part of my morning. So this is pretty interesting insight, right? Who would have thought a milkshake was being used for this very sort of discrete use case? So given this information, what are some of the things you might consider doing as the restaurant to your milkshake? So first thing is, the current customers seem not to care so much about the calories, but what if we made a healthier milkshake, something that's more appropriate for the morning? Make it with frozen yogurt, or start offering smoothies. Because there's probably a segment of customers who a milkshake would fit the other hiring criteria for, but they also want something that's healthy. And so by making this change, having this additional offering, they can bring even more customers who are looking for this commute savior. Another kind of off-the-wall idea is to offer thinner straws and specially designed cups that keep the milkshake at a certain temperature. And maybe potentially offer the milkshakes rather than small, medium, large. Offer them in durations. A 15-minute milkshake, 20-minute. It's like an egg, like a soft-boiled egg. 15-minute milkshake, 20-minute milkshake, 30-minute milkshake, to last the duration of that commute. And as you pointed out, adding more drive-through, add more sort of throughput for milkshakes. They could add more drive-throughs. They could also add like self-serve machines at the drive-through themselves. They could offer like prepaid like swipe cards. So all the customer has to do is either run in or pull up the drive-through, swipe their card, fill up their allotted amount of milkshake, and sort of move on, never having to interact with anyone. So these are just some of the ideas, off-the-wall ideas, both that have marketing elements and product elements. Ways you could augment the existing milkshake to solve this job for even more people. But again, this is just one job a milkshake is serving. Can you think of any other jobs a milkshake might be hired for in this restaurant?
Like a late night snack.
Yeah, awesome. And so if it's a late night snack, just off the top of your head, can you think of any changes you might make or any things to the milkshake you might do? Yeah, less caffeine. Yeah, smaller. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, those are great examples. Another example, one that Clay mentions is that, think about a parent who, a dad who brings in a child to the restaurant to order dinner for them. And all day long, the dad has been saying no to this kid. The kid wanted to sleep in and not go to school. Dad said no. Kid wanted to play instead of doing homework. Dad said no. Finally, they're at the restaurant and about to order. The kid looks up at the dad and says, "Dad, can I have a milkshake?" This is the one opportunity in the whole day that the dad gets to say, "Yes, you can have a milkshake," to the kid. And so in that moment, the milkshake is serving a completely separate job. It's making the dad feel like he's offering something to his son, where all day long he's been saying no. And you can think of other sort of like ways you could serve a milkshake, you could offer a milkshake to make it more compatible for that specific use case. So, going back to the question we were thinking about earlier, how big is the milkshake market? Is it the sum of McDonald's, Burger King, Baskin-Robbins, Shake Shack, Wendy's, and Dairy Queen? Is it the sum of all their milkshake sales? Or is it also competing with donuts, breakfast burritos, bananas, Snickers bars, bagels, and maybe even cigarettes? Because if you look at the hiring criteria for that first job, keep me interested and occupied during my commute, there's some overlap there. So the milkshake market is absolutely huge depending on the job it's doing. Cool. So we talked a little bit about the framework, how to apply it. I want to contrast it against another framework that's commonly used, especially in marketing, called personas. Is everyone here familiar with what a persona is? You really hit most of these. So it's very demographic based. It's gender, age, location, income. It's these attributes that we associate with someone that are pretty much immutable. They're very broad. It's a way to very broadly segment your customers. And like I mentioned, it's really focusing on the attribute of those customers. Contrasting that with jobs to be done is a little bit more narrow, right? We're honing in on what the functional, emotional, and social needs of customers. We're looking at what progress customers are looking to make in their lives. And we're looking at the outcomes customers are expecting to have as a result of that job. So rather than being focused on attributes, it's focusing on circumstances. What circumstances led a customer to hire or fire your product or service? What were the things in place in their life at that time that caused them to make that decision? And here's another quick example. So as you mentioned, a persona is a profile. So here's a typical persona card. Here's Alice. She's 35 years old. She's married. She has a marketing degree. She loves peanuts, chocolate, and nougat, and caramel. And she loves Snickers, has one every day. She has an active lifestyle and has 2 dogs. Does this give you any insight, any real insight into why Alice hired Snickers that day?
No, she loves peanuts and chocolate.
She loves peanuts and chocolate, yeah. But is that a job or is that a hiring criteria? So she hired the Snickers bar because she was hungry. She wanted to satisfy her hunger. And this is the basis behind Snickers' current campaign that's been going on. It's, about satisfying your hunger, about you not being who you are, you being a monster until you've had your Snickers bar. It's about satisfying that hunger, and it's not about the specific attributes in your life. Another way to think about it is, I'm 35. I live in San Francisco. I work in technology. These are the attributes that are specific to me and probably a lot of other people. But this morning I woke up, I went on a run, and I was an amateur runner. And then I came home and I looked at my personal email and I responded an email to a contractor because we're working on this fixer-upper investment property. So I'm an amateur real estate investor. And then I go to work and I'm a professional product manager, my day job. And then I come here and I speak with you guys, and I'm an amateur speaker. And so that's 4 different roles I've played. I've been, basically 4 different actors. And each one of those, I'm trying to accomplish something completely different. And so that's why just sort of like painting a brush with customers with attributes usually doesn't lead to product or marketing innovation, because you're not really diving into what is specific to their needs and their circumstances. So we talked a lot about food. How does this apply to software? Here's an example. Is anyone familiar with Fantastical? No one? Yeah, you're nodding. Okay, I knew at least there had to be some people. So I use, on a daily basis, 3 calendaring apps every single day. And I use them because I have specific jobs I need to get done. As a product manager, I'm always scheduling meetings. I need to set reminders because I have the memory of a goldfish. If it's not on my calendar, I'm going to forget it. But I have different jobs, different scenarios in which I need to utilize features that are provided by calendaring. Fantastical has repeatedly, over the course of 5-6 years, been the best at 2 very specific jobs that I have for my calendaring needs. And this is sort of highlighted here. The first is I want a very quick at-a-glance widget in my menu bar on my Mac that I can click, and it shows me a calendar, and I can quickly search for things where I know a keyword, and it'll just pop up. And I don't need to use the full screen. I can dock it right there. It doesn't disappear. The second thing it does is it allows me to very quickly, and a lot of applications are now offering this, but for my needs, Fantastical does it the best, to do natural language input of events. So I could type in lunch with John at this address and at this location. Fantastical parses all that, puts it in the event, and I click save, and it goes into my calendar. And it syncs with everything else, and it's amazing. So I use that for those specific jobs. But if I need to schedule a meeting with 10 different stakeholders across 3 different office locations, and I need to schedule meeting rooms and look at free busy times and pick who's optional and who's mandatory, and make sure that pre-reads get sent, those are very different jobs. And for those, I use different tools like Google's first-party calendaring app. So we talked a lot about the jobs and that people hire products and services to do, a little bit about how they are contrasted with personas. But how do you actually get insights from customers? One key thing about jobs to be done is you as a company, you as a product, don't get to decide what jobs people hire you for. You have to extract that from them. So how do you extract that information? There's a very specific sort of technique called the jobs to be done interview, sometimes called the switch interview. But basically, what you're trying to do is understand a timeline of events that caused them to hire your product, or in some cases, the timeline of events that caused them to fire your product. So from a high level, you don't want to focus on what they like or dislike about your product. For the purposes of jobs to be done, that's irrelevant. For other purposes, it's very important to understand that, but for the purposes of understanding why they came to you in the first place, that's pretty irrelevant. You want to get the customer to relive and talk through the struggle that they experienced that brought them to your product. And you want to understand what forces pushed that customer into your product, specifically honing in on functional, emotional, and social needs. So thinking about it like a timeline, you're basically this detective, and you're trying to piece together this mystery of how a customer came to your product. So it starts up here. The customer has a first thought. They think, and this is really where they crystallize a job that needs to be done. They obviously don't say, I have a job to be done. I need to blah, blah, blah. But they understand that there's a need that needs to be filled in order for them to attain some sort of progress. So it's very important for you to understand like that first thought from them. Ask a series of questions to get that first thought. Then they enter this sort of passive looking phase. Maybe they're reading tech meme, and they see an article that's sort of related to their job, and they might dig into that. And they do that enough times that it triggers this first event where they are now actively looking. And that means they're setting aside regular time to compare and contrast different options, different products and services that might fit their needs. Finally, they get into this deciding phase where they say, I'm going to use your product and or service. And maybe you offer a trial period. So they sign up for your trial, they start using it. And then another event happens, and they put money on the table. They give you their money. This is probably one of the most important events, is when someone puts money on the table, they're basically 99% sure that your product fits their particular job. And then they use your product as a paying customer for a while. They experience a delight, an aha moment, and then so that's the experienced event, and then they become a satisfied customer. So that's sort of the timeline. And like I said, what you really want to hone in on are event 1, event 2, buying and experience, and understand what sort of went through, what was the who, what, when, why, where for each one of those events. And as you understand that, you can sort of reveal new ways to potentially market your product. For instance, let's say what they experienced, that aha moment, maybe that's something you can offer for free in your trial. So you bring that up in the deciding phase, and then all of a sudden you have customers who are converting faster because they are more quickly getting to that aha moment. So the last thing I'd like to talk about is, as a product manager, I use product management sort of tactics to my own career. And I realized after learning about jobs to be done and practicing it that I accidentally was using it when thinking about my career. So here are some ways that might help you use this framework, practice this framework, but on your own career. So the first point is not specific to jobs to be done. Treat your career like a product. If you take classes at product school, you'll hear Carlos and the other instructors say this, like treat your career as a product. What this meant for me personally is setting very explicit goals with deliberate actions toward those goals. When I first was interested in transitioning into product management, I just sort of waded into it. I sort of dipped my toe. I said, oh, I'll talk to a customer, but then didn't really know what the next steps were. It wasn't until I said, okay, here are my goals, goal A, goal B, goal C. Here are the deliberate actions that I'm going to take to get those goals. But then the problem is, how do I come up with those goals? And so that's where Jobs to be Done sort of helped me crystallize what those goals were. So think about creating a timeline of events that led you to consider becoming a product manager, and pay specific attention to the functional, emotional, and social needs for each event. So going back to the timeline, think about the first thought where you say, hey, product management sounds pretty interesting. And if you are an existing product manager and you're looking in some other way to sort of level up your career, you can apply the sort of same timeline. That first thought that said, hey, I want to change my career in some way. And then sort of understand what are the events that cause you to commit to actually doing that, to becoming a product manager, whether it's going to product school, whether it's reading blogs or articles. And then finally, getting through all the way down to deciding, consuming, and satisfaction. Down there is where you're actually putting money on the table, whether it's going to product school, paying a course at product school to learn more about product management, or investing your own time and trying to get interviews at companies for product management. And then also think about what your hiring criteria is. We discussed hiring criteria earlier. It's the sort of criteria that decides whether or not a particular product or service is applicable for you based on your job. So you can think about the hiring criteria for you becoming a product manager. So for me, functionally, it was very important for me to stay close to technology, and it was also important for me to stay close to customers. Technology, because that's my background, I have a strong passion for it, but I also have a strong passion for getting in front of customers weekly and understanding their struggle. And so that sort of constrained sort of the set of roles, product manager roles, a little bit more that might be compatible. So socially, I needed to work on products that I felt were mission-driven, that were really pushing the world forward, that were making the world a better place. And that even further constrained kind of the the roles and the companies that were applicable for me. And then, emotionally, it was important for me to be with a team each and every day and interact face-to-face. I've tried doing remote work as an engineer. It was not for me. I felt disengaged. So emotionally, I needed that human connection in my day-to-day job. So that sort of removed that added another constraint. It was like I probably would not be successful in a role that required remote work. Cool. So if that's it. If you want to learn more about Jobs to be Done, these are the two. The top book is probably the most important one, Competing Against Luck. You can also probably get most of the value by just YouTube videos of Clay talking about the framework. Anthony Ulwick, who I mentioned earlier, has a great book on actually taking the theory and applying it in an existing organization. And then there's a ton of information out there on the web as well. And I think that is it. So do we open up the Q&A, Sam?
Just if you guys use jobs to be done at Square, or how do you use it? And if not, maybe how would you get it there?
Yeah, great question. So at Square, Square is divided into different sort of business units. So it's a sort of GM model where we have what we call Seller, Caviar, Square Cash, Square Capital. And within each one of those are kind of sub-business units. And each business unit is responsible for coming up with its own goals, its own product roadmaps that sort of roll up into sort of the broader, like top-level company objectives. The bonus of that is that product teams at each one of those levels are free to use whatever frameworks works best for them. So I use jobs to be done when I'm talking with customers, when I'm interviewing customers. And I know a lot of other product teams at Square have also used jobs to be done. I think, again, going back to what's most important about jobs to be done is that you need to understand, you don't use it to decide what you're going to build in order to be hired. You use it to understand why customers have hired you and to sort of use that as a leverage point. And you use it in combination with a lot of other frameworks. We have personas at Square still. We have other sort of product and innovation frameworks as well. So we definitely use it. I know Intercom, if you're familiar with Intercom, they use it. Intuit uses it. So it's being adopted pretty heavily. Yeah, that's a really good question. So having practiced this, there are a lot of sort of things to watch out for. One of them is this competing jobs to be done, where you can, it comes to like how do we it really comes down to how do we prioritize a job that we're going to focus on, and then also it's do these jobs sort of cannibalize and cancel each other out, and then the other sort of thing we've run into is how far into the product development process do you pull this framework? Because jobs can get very, very granular, and then you get jobs within jobs within jobs, and it becomes sort of like this abstraction. And then when you're actually trying to build the thing, you keep talking about the thing you're going to build, but you don't actually talk about what you need to build to sell that job. So for that specific case where you have multiple competing jobs, I think the most important thing is understanding what is the company, what is your company sort of best able to serve? What are the strengths that company has to serve? So if you discover a job and a new job that you had no idea people were using this for, like let's say for McDonald's, like people hired McDonald's because they had the best napkins. That it wouldn't be in McDonald's best interest to say, okay, stop everything, we're going to be in a napkin company. So still keeping in mind, like what is your core value props as a company and what are your key differentiators, help sort of prioritize those jobs. Any other questions?
Yeah, coming from design background, a lot of content in jobs to be done, just based on this conversation, seems pretty relevant to some of the design workshop, or sometimes designer create a journey map to map out the experience, and under each touch point that what you provide or offer to satisfy their needs. And that also sometimes cover like not just the functional needs, but also their social needs and also emotional desires. So I'm just curious that do you see some commonality there, or what are the differentiators between some of the design workshops versus the jobs to be done?
Yeah, that's a great point. So funnily enough, when I talk about this framework with designers, they're like, oh yeah, that's just design thinking, that's just building empathy. A lot of this is super compatible and super relevant, and there's a lot of overlap between this and doing journey maps or doing design sprints as well. I think where jobs to be done really excels is if a company has a great sort of like customer-focused design group, but marketing, engineering, and product are not on the same page. This, at a minimum, provides a common language that you can use when talking about your customers. So design, like design sprints or design thinking or journey maps, they have their own vocabulary. And if everyone else in the company is not on the same page with that vocabulary, then you can, there's sometimes friction there. And so jobs to be done is a way to have a common, a shared vocabulary when talking about customer struggles.
Usually people say that or you use personas or jobs to be done. Like one excludes the other. And do you think that's possible to use both?
So I think,
The question, please.
yeah, so the question was, is it possible to use both personas as well as jobs to be done? And I think it's a great question. I will say in my experience, I have not seen personas done very well. They've been heavily attribute focused. However, I could see, I was talking with Hamid Shricker, who's a presenter, an instructor at Product School about jobs to be done. And he said, well, what if you just create the right personas? And the personas are a lot more need-based and less attribute-based. And in that, yeah, I can definitely see a world where you're, like jobs to be done and that specific style of persona sort of intersect. So I don't think there's anything inherently bad with personas. I think it's more a framework that classifies users solely on like those attributes, those immutable attributes, is not the most effective way to uncover insights. Yeah.
Hey, could I have another look at that the diagram that showed the workflow between
the timeline?
First off to yeah. So one thing you talked about, so you could give us more examples of how you take like the satisfaction and the things at the end of that process and bring them up earlier to change, because you talked about using that to create a pre-product, but could you give us like a more specific example of what that looks like or how you've done that in the past?
Yeah, so I can give a concrete example at Square. So like I said, we use jobs to be done at Square. I'm on our developer platform team. So we are we're helping developers who want to build up against our APIs. And it turns out APIs have lots of jobs to be done. Developers building against our APIs have a ton of jobs to be done. Until recently, basically, when you come to sign up for a Square developer account, you would just say, hey, click here to get started and build your custom integration. In talking with customers, sort of three primary jobs emerged. One was around building an e-commerce solution. One was around building a sort of custom point-of-sale app, but using our payment processing. And one was building sort of a back office integration, something that maybe you're integrating with SAP or Oracle and you're calling your APIs. And so these are three distinct jobs that we weren't sort of like marketing. And so what we did is we took those three jobs and we put them on the sign-up page. We first A/B tested. We put them on the developer sign-up page, and we saw I think it was like a 10% increase in conversion. Conversion is basically for the first API call. 10% conversion uplift, I should say, in conversion between having a sort of a generic sign-up for Square, a Square developer account, and having these specific sort of job-based call to actions.
So you measure satisfaction as like first API call. So what does it look like to actually bring that satisfaction earlier into the timeline? Because I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah. So basically, when we talk to customers who are already here, and we ask them, why did you come to Square? What were you looking to do? And they said, this job, or this job. There are three jobs. And so they said there are other jobs as well, but those were like the highest clustering. And so basically we took that and we put it like right up here, right at the landing page. Yeah.
Do you use this framework to evaluate existing customers or to also evaluate the potential in the market?
I would say yes. I would say you could use it. You could use it for both. If you're using it by the book, it's supposed to be existing customers who have just started using your product. But I'll talk with any customer who wants to talk with me, and if I think I could learn something from them using this framework, I'll use it. As far as new market segments go, absolutely. If you're constantly hearing customers saying that they came to your product expecting something else, and then they left and went on to do something else, and you as a company are uniquely positioned to actually attack that market segment, then this framework has helped you sort of uncover that new segment. So you mentioned a lot of stuff. So I think so. You mentioned job story, and is that the sort of transformation of like the Agile user story into a job story? Is that what you came across? Okay. So yeah, for those who are unfamiliar, if you do research online, there is an article, a couple articles on there, how you take like a traditional Agile user story as a user. I want to blah blah blah, and then the hypothesis is for jobs to be done. You translate that into identifying the when, what, or the situation, the motivation, and the expected outcome. So when I want to do this, I expect, when I want to, situation, when this is happening, I want to do this, and I expect this to happen. So that's sort of an articulation, bad articulation of the job story. So on that specific point, like I don't use job stories. I feel like, as I was mentioning earlier, like when you pull down job stories so far into product development, it starts to create this abstraction, and you need to actually be able to tell the engineers what they're going to build. And by saying, here are all these situations and expected outcomes, it's not really clear. And so in my experience, it's helpful to sort of know how far to bring the that jobs to be done is. When I think about how far to bring it in, I don't normally bring it into like the PRD. Sometimes I might lightly mention jobs, but if there's like a one-pager or an intermission doc or like an internal press release, I'll tie like what we're trying to do, the why we're doing it, back to the job, and then that sort of becomes the grounding function for jobs to be done for a specific project. And in that, absolutely, we have customer quotes. We're saying Nancy, who's a developer in South Dakota, who's building an integration for Girl Scout cookie sales, really struggles because she feels that she can't trust our platform because of this, this, and this. And so this is the job. The job is she wants to feel safe and secure in our platform. And here's how we're going to tackle it. Does that answer?
I think that sort of touches on your unique approach to translating this to like development teams. It seems a little bit more like you're processing before you actually hand off to them. You're actually trying to figure out like what is it that we're going to build.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked with.
The job sort of like leaves it open to.
So yeah, because it's so new, I've talked with other product managers at some of the companies I've mentioned, and everyone sort of says the same thing. It's like it's a great framework for, first of all, for like you start with the go-to-market strategy. It's like here's the go-to-market, here's the campaign right at the beginning, even before we even have a product, and then it also helps build empathy, and it also helps sort of define, keep you honest with what you're building, but then it kind of loses its usefulness as you get more and more and more into product development.
So taking that point, how do you prioritize based on your current customers or your potential customers?
Yeah, it really goes back on what the company is uniquely positioned to do and what are the company objectives. So at Square, at the beginning of the year, Jack mentions this usually in the Q1 earnings call or the Q4 earnings call. He'll list 2 or 3 company objectives. So that's one metric. How applicable is this job to increasing or meeting one of these objectives? And then also, can we really serve this customer segment who has this job?
So as a product manager, you need to communicate with the developers, but sometimes the corner cases or what you're expecting have the gap between you and the developer understand. How do you close the gap?
How do I close the gap between sort of the what I expected to happen and what ultimately shipped? So I think that's not necessarily really. I think jobs to be done can help there. Usually, what I do is, I have my engineers sit in customer calls at least once a month, just so they can build that empathy. And when I know when I was an engineer, kind of in the same boat. The more often I was talking with customers, the more those customers were in my head while I was actually building the solution. And so I was able to sort of do a deep dive on this thing that I'm building. Is this the right way, the wrong way? Should I ask? So I say that along with just like Square is a highly collaborative environment. The engineers are actually responsible for kind of the how it gets done. The product manager's most important job, at least at Square, is identifying the why we should be doing something. And the designers are what we're building, what is user experience, and then the engineers are like, this is how we're going to do it. So, yeah.
I am a product designer, and I think that jobs to be done are a lot better than personas to talk with higher positions in a company. Because I don't know, personas sometimes they are so fluffy. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Alyssa Henry, who is my boss's boss's boss, she's the GM for Seller. She reports directly to Jack. She is a huge proponent of jobs to be done and tries to rally the company around it. So that is already sort of a plus. I will say that Square is the first company I've worked for that has embraced jobs to be done at the corporate level. I worked at other companies where it was like speaking another language, and I had to basically use jobs to be done like for my own kind of stuff and for my own engineering team. But then I had to like run it through a filter to talk to folks kind of up the food chain from me. So yeah, it's definitely that balance. It's one of those, like any framework, like Agile, Scrum, right? Needs buy-in from your top engineering to say, we're going to adopt this new framework. And that you need that support, you need that forcing function to have the whole company rally around it. But yeah, personas, I like how you described, like how you use the adjective fluffy. I think they can be fluffy. Jobs can be fluffy too sometimes, but yeah, personas can be difficult to work with. Yeah.
Can you speak to identifying what customers actually want the jobs to be? So for instance, maybe customers say they want good napkins at McDonald's, but what you find is that they actually want the French fries.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that process?
Yeah, so it really comes down to this. It really comes down to how you ask the question. So you're not necessarily asking them earlier. When we were talking with the milkshake purchaser, we asked them, why did you buy that milkshake? And they said, because I liked it, because I disliked it. And then we asked them, okay, if you were not to buy that milkshake, what else would you have bought? And that sort of helped us identify, first of all, the job, but then also sort of the hiring criteria. So using that same framework ideally helps you sort of understand like what the customer's needs are. Because to your point, customers for the most part, we think we know ourselves, but emotionally, functionally, socially, we act in very different ways than how we believe we act. And so it really comes down to that interview and understanding what those moments were that caused them to do the thing that you're trying to do. Does that answer the question?
Is there a component of the behavioral process as well?
Yeah, I mean, so literally in the first thought, you're asking things like, what time of day was it? What was the weather like? Who are you with? You're asking these very sort of intimate almost questions. And if you the first time you perform this style of interview, I felt very uncomfortable because you're actually diving into sort of like very, what could be considered more intimate elements of their life than that they're used to, a random person asking about. And so you really need to probe, dive deep, especially to like understand those emotional components. Yeah, so a PRD is an artifact that you use basically, product manager uses to describe like who the customer is, what the struggle is, kind of what the product requirements are to build a solution. And then depending on your company, your team, it might be 2 pages long, it might be 1 page long, it might be 25 pages long, where you're enumerating every single use case and edge case. So at Square is a very document-heavy company, but as it pertains to like product management, PRDs are, based on other companies I've been at, our PRDs are relatively light. And I personally, I've had other product managers do include the jobs to be done and the hiring criteria and a bunch of stuff in the PRD. As I mentioned earlier, I don't know that adds any value. I think it's important that those are communicated. So what I typically do is I create kind of that one pager that sort of like, if you're familiar with how Amazon does product development, Amazon starts with what they call an internal press release, which is like 1 page, maybe 2 pages, and it's written as though the customer were reading it. And it's meant to highlight the struggle the customer has. It's meant to talk about what you're going to do to alleviate that struggle. And then there's like an FAQ of how, it's sort of implementation details. And so in that document, that's where I sort of bring in jobs to be done. And then once that document, we're all aligned on that document and it's sort of the base principles in that document. Writing the PRD is a little bit easier, but I usually don't tie like a product requirement. I don't tie like a JIRA ticket all the way back to a job to be done.
Yeah, I have another question about where do you see jobs to be done not good at in the product development process? I'm thinking about the boundary of this thing. Like I can see that it's a good tool that I can apply to make improvement on my existing product, or even expand to a different market or user base. However, when I'm thinking about if a PM is hired for developing something that's never existed before, for example, like your senior executive just throw some, we have this AR, VR technology, build a product out of this. And so there's no existing experience with product. And can you apply this to?
I think to some degree, but I think you did highlight one thing. So like brand new, net new, white space sort of product innovation, it's difficult to apply any framework to that, right? Otherwise, like we'd all be like amazingly successful because we've all just applied this framework and from the earth, we have an amazing product that everyone uses. So this product isn't great for like brand new product innovations, at least in my experience. You can certainly use elements of it. There are some questions around, can you use this to identify new market segments? And you absolutely can. And you could build new products specifically for those market segments if your company is already uniquely able to serve those. So the VR example. So with Facebook and Oculus. So obviously Facebook acquired Oculus. Oculus was doing something completely different. But then Facebook knows, they know how people like to interact online. And so they can understand what jobs people use Facebook in communicating with other people, and they can apply that to this sort of net new sort of VR immersive technology. And they could use some of this framework to sort of uncover like what are those core use cases? Like what do we need to like knock out of the park in our MVP in order for people to continue using this? Cool. Any other questions? I'm also happy to talk about product management. Unrelated jobs to be done if there are any questions, or happy to talk one-on-one afterwards. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming out. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.